Imagine a woman stepping into sunlight after 24 years of living in absolute darkness. Her skin pale as paper, eyes fearful, unable to look directly at anyone. She's 42 years old, but looks like a ghost from a distant past. Josef Fritzl wasn't the victim of an ordinary kidnapping. She was the victim of the very man she called Dad, the one who turned the family basement into a dark prison, where 7 children were born in sin and silence. What could turn a father into history's most brutal monster? Welcome to the Case Files, where we explore the most shocking and mysterious cases in criminal history. Today, we're going deep into one of the most horrific stories ever recorded, a story about the ultimate evil that can hide within the most ordinary-looking homes. This isn't just a story about victim and perpetrator, but about the terrifying silence of an entire community for nearly a quarter century. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the infamous case of the Basement Monster, Josef Fritzl's 24 Years in Hell. Background and origins of evil. The story begins in the town of Amstetten, Austria in the 1970s, 1980s, a peaceful countryside with charming little houses and quiet life. Josef Fritzl, born in 1935, was an electrical engineer with a stern appearance, known by neighbors as a quiet, hard-working man. He lived with his wife Rosemarie and 7 children in a comfortable 3-story house at 40 Yibstrasse. Elisabeth, born April 6, 1966, was Josef's youngest daughter, a beautiful girl with bright blue eyes and a cheerful smile. No one could imagine that behind the appearance of a normal family lay the darkest secret in modern criminal history. But were there any warning signs of the coming tragedy? In fact, Josef had a history of domestic violence. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison in 1967 for raping a 24-year-old woman in Linz. Within the family, starting in 1977, when Elisabeth was only 11 years old, Josef began sexually abusing his daughter. And from the time she was 13, he had been secretly planning the most horrific crime of his life, preparing the hell basement. From 1981-1982, Josef began renovating the house's basement under the guise of a personal project, and strictly forbade anyone in the family from approaching this area. As an electrical engineer, Josef's frequent digging and moving of construction materials didn't raise anyone's suspicions. He spent 3 full years building a secret room measuring 35 square meters, only 1.7 meters high, shorter than an adult's height. The room was equipped with electrical systems, completely soundproofed, with a toilet, sink, gas stove, and small refrigerator, as well as a single bed. The entrance was carefully concealed behind a 500-kilo-long shelf, which could only be opened with a complex code and remote control that only Josef knew. He even installed an alarm system to know when anyone approached this area. The terrifying thing is that Josef calculated everything in detail and scientifically. He knew that sound couldn't escape, knew how to provide enough oxygen for people in the basement without being detected, and most importantly, he knew how to keep the secret for decades. The fateful day, August 28, 1984. "Elisabeth, come down to the basement and help me carry this new door up to the garage," Josef called to his daughter, with the same tone as always. This was the last thing Elisabeth heard from her father in the free world. Elisabeth, then 18 years old and just graduated from high school, was always an obedient child, never suspecting anything when she followed her father down to the basement. She was dreaming of becoming a college student and having a bright future ahead. When Elisabeth bent down to hold the door, Josef suddenly pressed an ether-soaked cloth to her face. The 18-year-old girl only managed to struggle for a few seconds, trying to call for help, but no one could hear her in the soundproof basement, before losing consciousness completely. Josef dragged his daughter into the secret room he had prepared for 3 years, a place that would become Elizabeth's prison for the next 24 years, 8,516 days of her life. When Elizabeth woke up, she found herself lying on an old bed in a dark, damp room, reeking of foul odors. Her hands were tied tightly to a metal pole, only able to move within half a meter. This was the moment her life was split in two. Before and after August 28, 1984. The perfect cover-up plan. Right after Elizabeth disappeared, Josef appeared before his wife and children with a convincing look of panic, saying he couldn't find Elizabeth anywhere. He pretended to be worried, searched everywhere, and encouraged the family to call the police. Rose Marie, the kind mother who trusted her husband completely, panicked completely. She couldn't believe her daughter could disappear without a trace. Police were notified and began investigating, but found no clues. A month later, Josef brought a handwritten letter to the police station, supposedly from Elizabeth. In the letter, she said that because she was so tired of family life and pressure from her father, she had decided to run away to join a religious organization. She wrote, "Please don't look for me anymore. I've found a new life and am happier." Josef even played the role of a suffering father in front of the police, saying that Elizabeth had mentioned wanting to join some sect because she felt life at home was too suffocating. He also expressed concern that his daughter might be exploited by extreme religious organizations. In reality, this was the letter Josef forced Elizabeth to write in the basement, with a pen and old paper. The police, having no other evidence, and seeing the handwriting looked like Elizabeth's, had to believe his testimony and closed the case file after a few months of investigation. The first days in hell. In the first days of captivity, Elizabeth lived in absolute terror. She was tied tightly to a metal pole, only able to move within half a meter. The room was dark, damp, without adequate ventilation. Foul odors filled the air everywhere, and rats scurried in the dark corners. Josef coldly warned Elizabeth, "This place has poison gas traps and high-voltage electrical systems. If you dare break the door or scream, the poison gas will kill you instantly. And if you try to escape, I'll kill the whole family upstairs." Although these threats weren't real, in her panicked and desperate state, Elizabeth believed every word from the cruel man. On the second day after being imprisoned, Josef began his first rape. He wrapped a noose around her neck, tightening it whenever she resisted. Elizabeth tried to fight back, but was completely powerless against the strength and brutality of the man she once called Dad. In the early years, no words were exchanged between father and daughter. Josef only came 3 times a week during the day when his wife and other children weren't home, committed his depraved acts, abused her, then left like a wild animal. While life in absolute darkness, food and water were brought down 3 times a week, usually stale bread, few vegetables, and canned meat. Elizabeth lived in the worst conditions imaginable. No sunlight, suffocating air from poor ventilation, and constant fear that Josef could appear at any moment. She had no calendar, no clock, couldn't distinguish day from night. Time passed like an endless chain of dark days. Elizabeth began keeping notes on small pieces of paper to track time, counting each day by carving marks on the wall. At night, when Josef wasn't around, Elizabeth often heard the footsteps of family members above, her mother, siblings, and friends visiting. She knew normal life continued just a few meters away, but couldn't scream for help for fear Josef would carry out his threats. In the first year, Elizabeth tried to dig a tunnel with her bare hands to escape, but discovered that Josef had poured very thick concrete on all the walls. She even tried to break the door with simple tools, but the thick steel door and complex electronic lock made all efforts futile. The first 2 years and first pregnancy. After 2 years of imprisonment and continuous rape, Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant for the first time in 1986. Under conditions of severe malnutrition and extreme stress, she miscarried at 10 weeks. This was a double pain, losing the child and having to endure physical pain alone in the dark basement. Josef completely ignored his daughter's health condition. He even seemed annoyed that Elizabeth didn't complete the task and continued raping her, even while she was still recovering from the miscarriage. During this time, Elizabeth began keeping a diary on pieces of paper and old fabric to record every detail of what she had to endure. She hoped that one day, if she had a chance to escape, these records would be evidence to accuse Josef of his crimes. Kirsten is born, the first child. On August 30th, 1988, after more than 4 years of imprisonment, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, a baby girl named Kirsten. The birth took place completely in the dark basement, with no doctor, no pain medication, only an old childbirth guidebook that Josef had given her 2 months earlier. Elizabeth, then 22 years old, had to cut the umbilical cord herself with a dull pair of scissors and bandage the wound with old cloth pieces. The scene of a young girl having to give birth alone under such harsh conditions is one of the most heartbreaking images in this entire case. Kirsten was born healthy, and this became the only ray of light in Elizabeth's life. She began to have a reason to live, to fight. Although the child was also imprisoned with her mother, Elizabeth was determined to do everything to protect and raise her child in the best conditions possible. The heartbreaking thing is that Kirsten would live her first 19 years in this basement, not knowing what the outside world looked like, only knowing light from the dim electric lamp and sounds from the small TV that Josef brought down. The next children. On February 1990, Elizabeth gave birth to Stefan, her first son. This time, the birth was slightly easier because Elizabeth had experience, but still under conditions of deprivation and extreme pain. Stefan was born healthy and became Kirsten's first friend. The two children grew up in this strange world, only knowing the 35-square-meter basement, their mother, Elizabeth, and occasionally the frightening appearance of the big man they didn't know was their biological father. Elizabeth tried her best to create a normal world for her children. She taught them to speak, read, write by the dim light from the single lamp. She told fairy tales, sang lullabies, and explained about the outside world that she herself had forgotten after many years. On August 29, 1992, Lisa was born, the second daughter. But Josef had different plans for baby Lisa. The basement was now becoming too crowded with 4 people, and the crying of children could make neighbors suspicious. The foundling plan begins. In May 1993, when Lisa was 9 months old, Josef implemented his first plan to reduce pressure in the basement. He forced Elizabeth to write a letter according to his instructions, then brought Lisa upstairs and placed the baby in a cardboard box in front of the house at night. The next morning, Rosemary discovered a child in front of the house, along with a handwritten letter. "Mom can't take care of the child. Please raise the baby for me. Elizabeth." Rosemary, who hadn't seen her daughter for 9 years, was overjoyed thinking that Elizabeth was still alive and trusted the family to entrust her child to them. She immediately called police and applied to adopt the child. Josef played the role of a worried father, appearing surprised but ready to adopt his grandchild. The irony was that Lisa was raised in the same house where her biological mother and siblings were imprisoned right below. She got to go to school, play in the garden, and live a normal life, while Elizabeth had to watch her child being taken away without being able to do anything. Monica and Alexander. The next discoveries. On February 26, 1994, Monica was born. And like Lisa, in December 1994, 10-month-old Monica was discovered in a stroller in front of the house. This time, Rosemary also received a phone call from a female voice that sounded like Elizabeth. I left it there, then hung up. Despite her doubts, Rosemary still believed that Elizabeth was living somewhere and couldn't raise children. She continued to adopt Monica and care for her like her own child. On April 28, 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twins, 2 boys, Alexander and Michael. However, Michael was born with serious health problems. Elizabeth begged Josef to take the child to the hospital, but he refused outright. What will be, will be. If it lives, it lives. If not, so be it, Josef said coldly. Baby Michael died after 3 days for lack of medical care. Josef personally burned the baby's body in the furnace in the basement, in front of Elizabeth and the children. Alexander was lucky to survive, and 15 months later was discovered in front of the house like his 2 sisters before. The boy was also adopted by Rosemary and lived upstairs, expanding the basement. By 1993, with 4 people living in the 35-square-meter basement, Elizabeth, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, who would be born in 2002, the space became too cramped. Josef had to expand the area to 55 square meters, but couldn't hire workers to avoid being discovered. He forced Elizabeth along with Kirsten and Stefan, the 2 children then 5 and 3 years old, to use their bare hands to dig soil, move rocks, and expand the basement for many years. This was cruel and exhausting work, but Elizabeth had no other choice. This expansion process lasted for years. Elizabeth and the children had to dig soil by hand, put it in small plastic bags, then Josef would bring it upstairs and dispose of it. Elizabeth's hands were constantly scratched and bleeding, but she had no bandages for care. Felix, the last child. On December 16, 2002, Felix was born, Elizabeth's 7th and final child. At this time, Elizabeth was 36 years old, having gone through 18 years of imprisonment. Josef decided to keep Felix in the basement because he thought his wife couldn't take care of another child. Felix grew up with his mother and 2 siblings, Kirsten and Stefan, in the basement. The boy didn't know the outside world existed and considered the basement his entire universe. Living conditions, getting worse. Over time, living conditions in the basement got worse. Poor ventilation, high humidity caused mold to grow everywhere. Elizabeth and the children frequently suffered from respiratory diseases. When power was cut, which happened often and lasted up to 10 days, the whole family had to live in absolute darkness. Food in the refrigerator spoiled, there was no hot water, and most electrical equipment couldn't be used. Elizabeth continued keeping her diary, counting each day by carving marks on the wall. She taught the children to read and write by the light of the old dim TV. She told them about the outside world, about plants, animals, the sea, things she herself had almost forgotten. The 2000s, hope and despair. Entering the 21st century, Elizabeth had gone through nearly 20 years of imprisonment. She was now a middle-aged woman with 3 grown children. Kirsten, 12 years old, Stefan, 10 years old, and newborn Felix. Kirsten, the eldest child, began having serious health problems. Inbreeding and terrible living conditions had affected her development. Stefan also showed signs of developmental delays and psychological problems from never being exposed to sunlight. Elizabeth, although exhausted and desperate, still tried to maintain spirits for her children. She taught them everything she knew, from basic math to world history that she remembered from school. Josef continued raping Elizabeth regularly, although she was 40 years old and in poor health. It's estimated that over 24 years, Elizabeth was raped more than 3,000 times, a horrific number that's hard for anyone to imagine. Normal. Life above. While Elizabeth and 3 children were imprisoned in the basement, the Fritzl family life above continued normally. Rosemarie cared for the 3 adopted grandchildren, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, like her own children. These 3 children went to school, had friends, played in the garden, and swam in the pool, a completely different life from their biological siblings. Josef continued playing the role of father and exemplary grandfather. He even participated in community activities and was praised by neighbors for his dedication to family. Neighbors never suspected anything about the strange sounds from the basement because Josef had soundproofed very well. Occasionally there were machine noises or hammering sounds, but everyone thought those were normal repair projects of a retired electrical engineer. 2008, the fatal illness. By April 2008, Kirsten, now 19 years old, began having seizures and severe headaches. Her condition worsened, and on April 19th, Kirsten suddenly fell into a coma due to severe brain oxygen deprivation. Elizabeth, in a state of complete panic, begged Josef to take her child to the hospital. This was the first time in 24 years she made such a request with a mother's desperation. Josef initially refused, but when he saw Kirsten could die, he feared everything would be discovered. He forced Elizabeth to write a letter explaining Kirsten's condition, then took her to the hospital, claiming she was his granddaughter found in critical condition in front of the house. Amstetten Hospital, where truth began to emerge. When Kirsten was brought to Amstetten Hospital, doctors immediately noticed abnormal conditions. The girl had pale skin like someone who had never been exposed to sunlight, serious health problems, and most importantly, blood tests showed she suffered from a rare disease that only appears in children born from incestuous parents. Dr. Reiter, who was treating Kirsten, requested to meet the girl's mother to understand her medical history. Josef claimed that Kirsten's mother, Elizabeth, had been missing for years, and her whereabouts were unknown. He gave the doctor a letter Elizabeth had written, according to his instructions, explaining her child's condition. But Josef's evasive attitude, contradictory statements, and unreasonable details in his story made doctors suspicious. On April 22nd, Dr. Reiter decided to call police. On April 25th, the hospital made a public appeal on television, asking Kirsten's mother to come to the hospital to provide necessary medical information for treatment. Elizabeth's appearance. On April 26, 2008, after 24 years of disappearance, Josef Fritzl suddenly appeared at Amstetten Hospital. This was a historic moment, the first time in nearly a quarter century that she saw sunlight. Elizabeth appeared with her 2 sons, Stefan, 18 years old, and Felix, 5 years old, 2 children who had never seen the outside world. All 3 looked sickly, pale, and frightened by everything around them. Josef, when he saw Elizabeth appear, had prepared a story that his daughter had decided to return after years of wandering. But Elizabeth's fearful attitude when seeing her father and the way she clung to her children made medical staff suspicious. A doctor called police with suspicious information. Police arrived immediately and detained both Josef and Elizabeth for questioning. Historic testimony. Initially, Elizabeth refused to cooperate with police. She told them, "No one will believe me. No one will believe if I tell the truth." 24 years of threats and psychological terror had made her lose all faith in anyone's ability to help her. Only when police promised to absolutely protect her and her children's safety, guaranteeing she would never have to see Josef again, did Elizabeth begin telling her story. For 2 full hours, Elizabeth recounted the entire 24 years of hell. Being tricked into the basement, 8,216 days of imprisonment, more than 3,000 rapes, giving birth to 7 children in terrible conditions, Michael's death, and how Josef brought 3 other children upstairs to live. Police initially found it hard to believe this story because it was too horrific and complex. but the specific details Elizabeth provided, along with her and her children's health conditions, convinced them this was the truth. Josef's arrest. On April 27, 2008, Josef Fritzl was officially arrested. In the first 24 hours, he still tried to deny and make up other stories. But when police confronted him with Elizabeth's detailed testimony and threatened to search the entire house, Josef finally had to admit. He showed police the location of the secret basement. If you want to find the basement, move the heavy bookshelf in the basement. There's a steel door with the code 9543672. Inside is where I kept Elizabeth. Discovering the basement. When police conducted the search, they discovered the carefully concealed entrance. The thick steel door opened with the complex code, as Josef had indicated. Stepping inside, everyone was shocked by the scene before them. The basement consisted of 4 small rooms, with ceilings only 1.7 meters high, damp, dark, and reeking of foul odors. There was an old bed, a small TV, refrigerator, and old gas stove. On the walls were thousands of marks that Elizabeth had carved to count days. Most importantly, police found Elizabeth's thick diary recording details of 8,516 days of imprisonment. Each page contained shaky writing, telling of pain, fear, rapes, and rare happy moments with her children. An investigator described, "This is a prison designed and built, with planning and detailed calculation. I can't imagine how anyone could survive in such conditions for 24 years. Public reaction. When news of the case was announced, all of Austria and the world were shaken. International media flocked to the small town of Amstetten. Josef Fritzl was called the basement monster and devil in human form. The Fritzl family's neighbors all expressed shock and disbelief. One neighbor said, "Josef was a quiet man, but I thought he was just not very talkative. No one could have suspected such horrible things were happening right under our feet." The Austrian government had to issue an official statement condemning Josef's actions and promising maximum support for Elizabeth and her children. Prime Minister Alfred Gusenbauer said, "This is an abhorrent crime that cannot be forgiven. We will do everything to help the victims reintegrate into society." Rosemarie, the unfortunate wife, Rosemarie Fritzl, Josef's wife and Elizabeth's mother, fell into severe shock when learning the truth. Throughout 24 years, she had no idea about her husband's crimes and truly believed Elizabeth had run away. Police determined Rosemarie was completely innocent and also a victim of Josef. She had raised the 3 adopted grandchildren, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, with genuine love, not knowing they were her own daughter's children. Upon learning the news, Rosemarie immediately filed for divorce and declared she was cutting all ties with Josef. She told police, "I lived with a monster for 52 years without knowing it. How can I forgive myself?" Many people questioned how Rosemarie could know nothing during 24 long years. However, Josef was very careful and psychologically manipulative. He always had reasonable explanations for everything. Noises from the basement were due to repairs, frequently bringing food down was for personal projects, and long absences were for work. Moreover, Josef was secretive and domineering. He forbade family members from approaching the basement, and anyone who didn't obey was threatened and abused by him. Rosemarie, after years of being suppressed by her husband, had gotten used to not asking questions and just obeying. Deeper investigation, terrifying discoveries. When police examined the basement more thoroughly, they discovered many more horrific details. In a dark corner of the basement were piles of ashes, remains of baby Michael, after being burned by Josef in the furnace. Investigators also found hundreds of audio cassettes and videos that Josef had recorded over the years. Some tapes recorded Elizabeth giving birth, times when she begged to take her children to the hospital, and even times when Josef abused her. Particularly noteworthy was a notebook where Josef kept meticulous records like a crime diary. He recorded each rape, evaluated Elizabeth's performance, and even drew diagrams planning basement expansion. Psychological experts analyzed that Josef displayed all signs of a control freak. He not only wanted to possess Elizabeth physically, but also wanted to completely control her life and mind. The basement was not just a place of imprisonment, but also the kingdom he created to be Lord. Extended investigation. Police expanded the investigation to see if Josef had committed similar crimes against anyone else. They discovered that in 1967, Josef had been sentenced to 18 months in prison for raping a 24-year-old woman in Linz. However, after being released, he seemed to have improved his behavior, at least in front of others. The scary thing is that Josef had planned this crime very early. Construction records showed he began renovating the basement in 1981, when Elizabeth was only 15 years old. This means he had secretly prepared for 3 years for the day he would kidnap his daughter. Legal experts considered this one of the longest planned cases in history. Josef didn't act on impulse or emotion, but was a cold calculator executing a brutal plan systematically. The victim's health condition. Elizabeth and her 3 children, Kirsten, Stefan, Felix, were all in alarming health conditions. Besides severe malnutrition and vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight exposure, they also suffered from many other ailments. Kirsten, besides brain oxygen deprivation leading to coma, also had bone and joint problems from inadequate exercise. Stefan suffered from intellectual developmental delays and difficulties in social communication. Felix, the youngest child, showed fear of everyone except his mother and 2 siblings. Doctors determined that all 4 people needed long-term psychological treatment to reintegrate into society. The most concerning thing was the children's psychology. They didn't understand the outside world and considered the 55-square-meter basement their entire universe. Elizabeth, despite being severely damaged physically and mentally, still showed amazing strength. She always put her children's safety and welfare first. Even during police interviews, she only worried about whether her children were being well cared for. The 3 children living normally. Lisa, 16 years old, Monica, 14 years old, and Alexander, 12 years old, the 3 children who were brought up to live with their grandparents, also had to face terrible psychological shock. In one night, they discovered that the mother they thought had abandoned them was actually imprisoned right below their feet, and the grandfather they loved was actually the most brutal criminal. Psychological experts said these 3 children could be psychologically affected no less severely than their siblings who lived in the basement. They had to face guilt for having lived happy lives while their mother and siblings endured hell, along with confusion about their identity and origins. The trial of the century. The trial of Josef Fritzl officially opened on March 16, 2009, at the court in St. Pölten. This was called the Trial of the Century due to its serious nature and international public attention. Josef was charged with 6 serious crimes: rape, unlawful imprisonment, incest, coercion, forcing acts against will, infanticide, murder for neglecting the newborn twin to death, and enslaving humans for years. He appeared in court in a black suit, covering his face with a blue folder to avoid camera lenses. Josef's attitude in court remained cold and arrogant, showing no remorse or shame. Initially, Josef admitted to rape, imprisonment, incest, and coercion, but denied murder and enslavement. He argued that Michael died from natural illness and that he had cared for Elizabeth and the children for 24 years. However, when the court played Elizabeth's video testimony detailing Michael's death and how Josef refused to take him to the hospital, along with evidence of terrible living conditions in the basement, Josef was forced to change his testimony. On the second day of trial, Josef suddenly changed his plea and admitted guilt to all 6 charges. He said, "I'm sorry. I don't want Elizabeth to have to come here and tell these painful stories again." However, many believe Josef only admitted guilt to prevent Elizabeth from having to testify in court, which could cause her further harm and possibly reduce the severity of the sentence. Life sentence. After 3 days of trial, on March 19, 2009, the court sentenced Josef Fritzl to life imprisonment without parole. He was imprisoned at Stein Maximum Security Prison, where Austria's most dangerous criminals are held. Judge Andrea Humer said in the sentence, "The defendant's actions were brutal and unforgivable. You turned your own daughter into a slave, robbed 24 years of her freedom, and caused irreparable damage. This is one of the most serious crimes in Austrian history." Josef heard the sentence without any reaction. In his final statement, he said he would not appeal and accept the consequences of my actions. However, due to loopholes in Austrian law at the time, there was a possibility Josef could be considered for parole after 15 years, i.e. in 2024, if he showed good rehabilitation. This outraged public opinion, and the Austrian government had to promise to consider amending the law. New life under protection. After being freed, Elizabeth, now 42 years old, along with her 6 surviving children, Kirsten, Stefan, Felix, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, received maximum protection from the Austrian government. They were taken to a secret location called Village X, a specially built complex with strict security systems. Village X is a separate residential area surrounded by high fences with 24/7 security cameras and constant police patrols. The place is designed like a small community with full amenities, classrooms, medical rooms, play areas, and even a small garden, so the family can gradually get used to open spaces. Initially, Elizabeth and the 3 children who had lived in the basement all showed fear of large spaces. They were used to living in confined spaces and felt unsafe seeing the open sky. Kirsten initially even refused to go outside because she feared the ceiling would collapse. The integration process was very slow and required patience from specialists. Elizabeth and her children had to learn everything from scratch: how to use phones, understand money, communicate with strangers, and even how to eat normal foods. Treatment and recovery process. A team of psychological, social, and medical specialists was specially assigned to support Elizabeth's family. They had to face unprecedented challenges in psychiatric medicine history. Stefan and Felix, the 2 sons, faced the greatest difficulties in integration. They didn't understand basic social concepts, didn't know how to play with other children, and often had panic attacks when meeting strangers. Kirsten, although she had awakened from her coma, still had long-term health problems. She needed many months to relearn how to speak and move normally. Elizabeth proved to be the strongest in the family. She quickly adapted to the new life and always encouraged her children. However, specialists said she still had frequent nightmares and was always in a state of high alertness. The 3 children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, also needed psychological support to deal with guilt and confusion about identity. Suddenly, learning that their biological mother and siblings had endured hell while they lived, happily was a terrible shock for teenagers. Elizabeth changes name and starts over. In 2009, Elizabeth officially changed her name to protect her identity and begin a new life. She didn't want her children to carry the Fritzl name, a name that had become a symbol of crime. With government support, Elizabeth began learning to drive, learning to use computers, and gradually getting familiar with the modern world. The amazing thing is that after everything she had been through, she still kept her ability to love and trust. Elizabeth showed particular interest in her children's education. She wanted her children to have the opportunities she had been denied. Although she couldn't attend university as she had dreamed in her youth, Elizabeth continued studying constantly to be able to teach and support her children in the best way possible. Rosemary and efforts to reconcile. The relationship between Elizabeth and her mother, Rosemary, was initially very tense. Elizabeth felt angry because her mother had lived with Josef for 24 years without discovering anything. Meanwhile, Rosemary was haunted by guilt and blamed herself. It took many months of psychological treatment before mother and daughter began to understand and forgive each other. Elizabeth gradually realized that her mother was also a victim of Josef, and Rosemary also understood her daughter's pain. Rosemary moved to live near Village X to be able to see her children and grandchildren regularly. She became an important source of support for Elizabeth in caring for the grandchildren, especially the 3 children Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, whom she had raised since they were small. Josef in prison. The final years. Josef Fritzl is currently serving his sentence in a special detention unit at Stein Prison. Initially, he was placed in the psychiatric ward, but was later transferred to the regular prison section when doctors determined he didn't have mental illness. There are reports that Josef changed his name to Josef Meyerhoff in prison and appeared to show remorse. However, psychological experts in the prison said this might just be a ploy to get his sentence reduced. In 2019, when Josef was 84 years old, there were reports that he showed signs of memory loss and intellectual decline. However, many people suspected this was fake illness behavior to be transferred to a lighter detention regime. As of 2024, despite serving 15 years, the minimum time to consider parole, Josef still hasn't been released. Pressure from public opinion and the victim's family has caused the Austrian government to reject all parole proposals. Impact on Austrian society. The Elizabeth Fritzl case left a deep impact on Austrian society. The country's parliament quickly reviewed laws related to pardoning serious criminals, strengthened neighborhood, security inspection systems, and improved child protection measures. The case also changed how Austrians viewed domestic violence and warning signs. Many education and awareness programs were deployed to help communities recognize and report suspicious cases. The town of Amstetten, where the tragedy occurred, had to face unwanted attention from world media. The house at 40 Ibstrasse was sold and completely renovated to erase traces of the dark past. Painful lessons. The Elizabeth Fritzl case reminds us that crime can hide in the most ordinary places, in families that seem ideal. Josef Fritzl, in the eyes of neighbors, was an exemplary father, a talented engineer, and a trustworthy man. The story also shows the amazing power of will to live and maternal love. Elizabeth, in the most desperate circumstances, never gave up and always tried to create the best possible environment for her children. She taught them to read and write, told stories, and conveyed love through her own fierce life force. The case also raises questions about community and social responsibility. Were there signs we could have recognized earlier? How do we protect the vulnerable from abusers who plan and use sophisticated tactics? The Elizabeth Fritzl case is not only a story about the most brutal crime in modern history, but also proof of humanity's extraordinary will to live. From the deepest darkness, Elizabeth stood up, carrying the courage of a mother, a brave woman who overcame all challenges. Josef Fritzl, the exemplary father in society's eyes, was actually a hidden monster who destroyed his own daughter's entire life and poisoned the souls of innocent children. He represents the ultimate evil that can hide beneath a mask of normalcy. But this very story also reminds us that love, hope, and will to live can exist even in the most desperate circumstances. Elizabeth not only survived, but also protected and nurtured her children, giving them knowledge and love throughout 24 years of hell. Today, Elizabeth and her children are gradually integrating into normal life. They have proven that humans can heal the deepest wounds and rebuild life from broken pieces. Always listen and care about those around you. Sometimes, a caring gesture, a concerned question, or simply paying attention to unusual signs can become the last ray of light for those living in darkness. If you or someone you know is facing domestic violence, remember that help is always available. Don't stay silent in the face of crime. Each of us can be a hero in someone's story. Thank you for following the case files and listening to this painful but inspiring story. Please share to raise community awareness about hidden crimes and the importance of protecting each other. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss other intriguing cases. We'll meet again in the next episode with another story about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Imagine a 10-year-old girl vanishing without a trace in the blink of an eye, then reappearing 8 years later as a completely different person. But the most terrifying part wasn't the time she was missing. It was where she spent those years. In a secret bunker 2.5 meters underground, only 5 square meters in size, with not a single ray of sunlight ever reaching her. And when she escaped from that hell, she did something that shocked the entire world. She mourned for the man who had imprisoned her for 3,096 long days. Was this Stockholm Syndrome, or something far more complex and sinister? Welcome to the Case Files, where we explore the world's most shocking cases with the deepest and most detailed perspective. This is a show dedicated to those who are passionate about uncovering mysteries, real stories full of drama, and profound lessons about human nature. Today, we're going to step into one of the most shocking kidnapping cases in European history, a story of miraculous survival that's equally controversial. This story not only shook Austria, but forced the entire world to ask profound questions about human psychology, the resilience of the human spirit, and the fragile boundaries between victim and perpetrator. In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the infamous case of the Strasshof Captivity, the Natasha Kampusch case. 3,096 days of horror in a dark underground bunker, and one Austrian girl's escape from hell. Prepare yourselves, because today's story will take us through a range of emotions, from shock and horror to surprise and deep reflection. The setting: Vienna at the end of the 20th century. Let's turn back time to Vienna, Austria, in 1998. A peaceful city with low crime rates, where parents could still feel safe letting their children walk to school alone. This was a time before social media, before GPS, when a child's disappearance could shake an entire nation. In this context, the Kampusch family lived in the Donaustadt district, a relatively safe residential area. Natasha Maria Kampusch was born on February 17, 1988, the youngest of 3 sisters. Her father, Ludwig Koch, and mother, Brigitta Sirny, had separated when Natasha was still small. The little girl's life was no different from any other ordinary child, going to school, playing with friends, and being picked up and dropped off at school by her mother every day. But everything would change on one fateful day in the spring of 1998. The fateful morning, March 2nd, 1998. The morning of March 2nd, 1998 was an ordinary Monday in Vienna, the chill of European spring, with the first rays of sunlight beginning to pierce through the thin mist. Natasha Kampusch, 10 years old, woke up and prepared for a school day like any other. She wore a red jacket and carried a pink backpack, small details that would later become crucial, clues in the search. But that morning, something happened between mother and daughter. Perhaps it was a small argument like in any family, but its consequences would be extremely serious. Angry with her mother, for the first time in her life, Natasha decided to walk to school by herself instead of letting her mother take her as usual. At 7:15 a.m., the little girl stepped out of house number 57 on Renbahnweg. Brigitte Sirny stood behind the window, watching every step her daughter took until the small figure disappeared at a nearby intersection. That was the last image of Natasha in her mother's memory. A 10-year-old girl walking away with a sulky expression and determination to prove she was grown up. The distance from home to school was only about 200 meters, a few minutes' walk, a familiar route that Natasha had taken with her mother hundreds of times. But that morning, at that intersection, fate had arranged a destined encounter. The moment of life and death. When Natasha reached the intersection, she saw a man dressed in black standing next to a white van. His eyes were staring intently at her. In the mind of a 10-year-old child, this might have just been an ordinary stranger, so Natasha continued walking. But as she got closer, the girl felt something wasn't right. A child's instinct for danger was calling out, but it was too late. In a flash, that man, later identified as Wolfgang Psychlopel, had dragged the girl into the vehicle and sped away. A 12-year-old girl, the only witness to the kidnapping, later recounted that she had seen Natasha being pushed into a small white van with tinted windows. Natasha's screams rang out, then fell silent as the car door slammed shut. The vehicle sped north, taking an innocent child and leaving behind a mystery that would haunt Austria for the next 8 years. The Great Search. When 30 minutes had passed and Natasha still hadn't come home, Brigitte Sirny began to worry. She called the school and learned that her daughter hadn't attended class. Immediately, she called the police. At this point, the 12-year-old witness finally understood that what she had witnessed wasn't a joke, but a real kidnapping. Austrian police quickly deployed one of the largest search campaigns in the country's history. More than 700 white vans across the entire country were checked, one by one. Thousands of flyers with Natasha's image were printed and distributed throughout Europe. Television and newspapers all reported on this mysterious disappearance. The search was extended to neighboring countries like Hungary, because a few days earlier, Natasha had traveled with her father. Every clue, no matter how small, was tracked and thoroughly investigated. But everything seemed to lead to dead ends. Notably, among the 700 vehicles checked was one owned by Wolfgang Psychlopel, a 36-year-old telecommunications technician living in Strasshof an der Nordbahn, just an hour's drive from Vienna. When questioned, he calmly replied that the vehicle was used to transport building materials for home repairs, and he had an alibi proving he was at home at the time of the kidnapping. The fatal mistake. Police believed Wolfgang Psychlopel. They saw him as an ordinary person with no criminal record, stable employment, and an appearance that didn't arouse suspicion. This was a fatal mistake, a decision that would cost Natasha 8 years of her youth. In reality, at that moment, Natasha was lying in a dark bunker, just meters away, beneath the feet of the police officers questioning her kidnapper. But the bunker was built so sophisticatedly, with perfect soundproofing, that no one could detect her existence. Portrait of the perpetrator. Wolfgang Psychlopel wasn't an ordinary criminal. Born in 1962, he was an intelligent technician with deep knowledge of technology, electronics, and construction. In the eyes of colleagues, he was quiet, rather introverted, but didn't attract attention. Neighbors described him as a single man who kept to himself, occasionally helping elderly neighbors with household tasks. But behind that ordinary appearance was a sick individual who had meticulously planned his crime. Psychlopel had been stalking Natasha for a long time, studying the girl's school route, her family's habits, and especially preparing a perfect prison. He wasn't a kidnapper for ransom. Psychlopel's goal was to turn Natasha into his slave, someone who would serve him absolutely and could never escape his control. The hellish bunker, The prison that Psychlopal created could be described as a masterpiece of crime. Located 2.5 meters beneath the basement garage of his house in Strasshof, the room was only about 5 square meters, smaller than an average bathroom. The entrance was extremely cleverly disguised. To enter the bunker, one had to move a heavy china cabinet, then crawl through a narrow gap and open a thick steel door reinforced with cement. The entire process of entering and exiting took dozens of minutes, sometimes even hours. Inside the room, no windows, no natural light, only a single ceiling bulb. A ventilation system was installed to ensure Natasha wouldn't suffocate, but it was always at the minimum level. Most importantly, the room was perfectly soundproofed. No matter how loudly one screamed, it couldn't be heard from outside. This wasn't just a simple bunker, but a world created specifically for the victim. Psychlopal had even installed a camera surveillance system to monitor Natasha 24/7. Later, the room was upgraded, with TV, furniture, books, and even toys. But everything was just a tool for psychological control. The first days in darkness. When Natasha woke up in the dark bunker, she was just a panicked and desperate 10-year-old girl. For the first few days, she was locked in the room 24/7, not allowed out for even a second. Food was brought down through a small slot, and drinking water was also strictly controlled. Psychlopal immediately began the process of taming Natasha. He lied that her family was no longer searching for her, that the outside world had forgotten her existence. This was the first psychological blow aimed at breaking a child's will and hope. A strict reward and punishment system was established. Obedience would be rewarded with food, light, and even books to read. Resistance would result in starvation, darkness, and beatings. According to what Natasha shared later, there were weeks when she was beaten up to 200 times. He forced her to call him Master, Herr, and claimed to be an Egyptian god. How could a 10-year-old child resist such a brutal control system? The cruel taming process. For the first 6 months, Natasha was completely imprisoned in the bunker. This was the most brutal period, when Psychlopal tried to completely break the girl's spirit. He used every method from physical violence to mental torture. Natasha wasn't allowed to bathe properly, had no appropriate clothing, and had to live in terrible sanitary conditions. Food was strictly controlled. Sometimes, she was starved continuously for days as a form of punishment. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the physical violence, but the subtle brainwashing process. Psychlopal constantly convinced Natasha that she was worthless, that no one cared about her, and that he was the only person in this world who loved her. This was a cruel psychological tactic aimed at creating complete dependence. The terrifying adaptation. After 6 months, when Psychlopal felt he had tamed Natasha, he began allowing her to leave the bunker during the day to do housework, cooking, cleaning, washing. But the condition was that she had to work naked or wearing very little clothing, and every night she had to return to her prison. Over time, the relationship between Natasha and Psychlopal became frighteningly complex. He sometimes appeared kind, giving her gifts, even buying books and toys. But this wasn't kindness. It was part of his psychological control strategy. The prison gradually was improved with TV, radio, books, and even a study desk. Natasha was allowed to learn German, read books, and watch TV. But everything was strictly controlled and censored. He wanted to create the illusion that this was her home, where she was protected from the dangerous outside world. The dark years. From 1999 to 2005, Natasha went through what were perhaps the darkest years in a human being's life. She grew from a 10-year-old child into a teenager under brutal captivity conditions. When Natasha entered puberty, the situation became worse. Psychlopal began sexually abusing her regularly. In her autobiography, 3096 Days, published in 2010, Natasha recounted that there were nights she was chained to his bed. He forced her to cut her hair according to his wishes and treated her like a possession. But miraculously, despite such harsh circumstances, Natasha maintained her intelligence and will to live. She self-educated through books and TV and developed her language skills remarkably. When rescued, police were amazed by her intelligence and ability to articulate. Missed opportunities. In 2005, after 7 years of captivity, Fritzl began trusting Natasha more. He allowed her to walk in the garden and even go outside, to the supermarket, occasionally skiing. These could have been golden opportunities to escape from hell, but 7 years of captivity had left deep psychological wounds. Natasha recounted that she had tried to use her eyes to call for help. She stared intently at a traffic police officer on duty, hoping he would understand the message. "Please save me." But that officer paid no attention to the pleading eyes of a 17-year-old girl. At the supermarket, when standing alone near the checkout counter, while Fritzl was shopping elsewhere, Natasha hesitated for a long time. It was a moment of intense psychological struggle. Part of her wanted to cry for help, but another part feared the terrible consequences that Fritzl had threatened. He had warned that if she dared betray him, she would disappear from this world. Why didn't Natasha call for help? This is a question many people ask, but they don't understand the power of the brainwashing process and psychological dependence after 7 years of contact with only one human being. The day of rebirth, August 23, 2006. 12:53 p.m. on August 23, 2006. A moment that would change Natasha's life forever. By then, she was 18 years old, having become a young woman after 8.5 years of captivity. That day, the weather was beautiful, with warm Austrian summer sunshine. Natasha was tasked with using a vacuum cleaner to clean Fritzl's red BMW 850i in the garden. This was one of the sports cars he loved, and caring for it was one of Natasha's regular duties. Suddenly, Fritzl's cell phone rang. Because the vacuum cleaner was too loud, he had to step deep into the house to answer the phone. This was the moment Natasha had been waiting for throughout 8 years. With amazing quick thinking, Natasha deliberately turned the vacuum cleaner to maximum volume, forcing Fritzl to go even further into the house to hear the call clearly. She looked toward the door and saw it was slightly open, something that rarely happened. At this moment, Natasha's heart was pounding. She knew this might be the only chance in her lifetime. Without much thought, she put down the vacuum cleaner and decided to execute the escape plan she had been nurturing in her heart for years. The life or death escape. Natasha rushed out of the gate, running faster than she had ever run in her life. For the first 200 meters, she ran through grass fields and empty streets of Strasshof. Her heart pounded like drums, her breathing was rapid, but she didn't dare stop or look back. She encountered a passerby and begged them for help. "Please call the police. I'm Natasha Kampusch. I've been kidnapped for 8 years." But the man appeared cold and indifferent, perhaps thinking this was a girl with mental problems, and continued walking without caring. With no other choice, Natasha continued running with fading hope. After running frantically for 5 minutes, she saw an old house with a small garden. She hurriedly knocked on the door, her hands trembling violently. A 71-year-old woman opened the door and saw a girl as thin as a skeleton, pale as death, with eyes full of terror and exhaustion. Natasha said with a trembling voice, "Ma'am, I'm Natasha Kampusch. Please call the police." The woman immediately understood the importance of the situation. The name Natasha Kampusch was still famous locally because police had never given up searching for her. She immediately called the police. At exactly 1:04 p.m., police arrived at the house. When she saw the police uniforms, for the first time after 3,096 days, Natasha could breathe a sigh of relief. The longest nightmare in Austrian criminal history had finally ended. Oh, the end of the perpetrator. Meanwhile, when he discovered Natasha had escaped, Psychlopal didn't try to chase her or flee. He knew the game was over. He took his red sports car and drove to Praterstern station in Vienna's suburbs. At 8:59 p.m. that same day, Wolfgang Psychlopal jumped in front of a train and committed suicide. He ended his life at age 44, leaving behind a story that would trouble psychologists and criminologists for decades to come. Before his death, he had told Natasha, "The police will never catch me alive." And he kept his word. Shocking discoveries. When police searched Psychlopal's house, they discovered a masterpiece of crime. The bunker was built with astonishing sophistication, perfect soundproofing, adequate ventilation, even surveillance cameras. In the room, police found TV, furniture, clothes, books, toys, bottled water, and even small gifts. This wasn't just a simple bunker, but a miniature world designed to imprison a human being for life. They also discovered Natasha's passport, the final evidence confirming her identity after 8 years of disappearance. Natasha's condition. When rescued, Natasha weighed only 48 kilograms, just 3 kg more than when she was 10 years old. She had grown only 18 centimeters over 8 years. Doctors said her body was severely malnourished, her skin pale like a seriously ill person. But amazingly, her intelligence had developed well. Natasha could speak German fluently, understood many topics, and showed remarkable intelligence. This demonstrated the superior power of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Controversial reactions. But what shocked public opinion most wasn't Natasha's physical condition, but her psychological reaction to Psychlopal's death. She cried endlessly when she heard the news of her kidnapper's suicide. She even went to the morgue to light candles in his memory. This caused public uproar and raised questions. Was this Stockholm Syndrome? Or was Natasha hiding some truth? When journalists asked if Psychlopal was a sexual predator, Natasha defended him. No, Wolfgang Psychlopal's nickname, wasn't that kind of person. We had a special relationship. These words poured fuel on the fire of controversy. The media began asking difficult questions. Had Natasha really been kidnapped, or had she stayed voluntarily? Had she fallen in love with her kidnapper? The complex truth. Psychologists explained that Natasha's reaction was completely normal for someone who had spent 8 years in contact with only one human being. From age 10 to 18, the most important years in personality formation, Natasha only knew Psychlopal. This wasn't simply Stockholm Syndrome, but a much more complex psychological phenomenon. Natasha had become completely dependent on her kidnapper for survival. In her narrowed world, Psychlopal was both enemy and protector, both torturer, and the only person who cared about her. The story of Natasha Kampusch isn't just a simple kidnapping case, but a profound lesson about the strength of the human spirit, the ability to survive in the harshest circumstances, and the immeasurable complexity of human psychology. After 3,096 days in darkness, Natasha not only survived, but became a symbol of will, perseverance, and the ability to overcome oneself. Life after hell. After being rescued, Natasha's recovery journey truly began. She had to face not only physical injuries, but also the cruel curiosity of the media and unfounded rumors from public opinion. Many people questioned her abnormal reaction to Psychlopal's death, her lighting candles in his memory, and even doubted the authenticity of the entire story. But Natasha proved she was stronger than anyone imagined. Instead of drowning in pain and hatred, she chose the more difficult path, turning her horrific experience into motivation to help others. In 2010, Natasha published her first autobiography, 3096 Days, a work detailing what she experienced during 8 years of captivity. The book wasn't just a tale of pain, but proof of the strength of the human spirit. The book's success opened opportunities for Natasha to share her story with the world. In 2016, she published her second book, mainly about the recovery process and reintegration into society. In 2019, her third book was released, focusing on refuting the attacks and bullying she endured from media and portions of public opinion for many years. Or from victim to helper of others. What's most admirable about Natasha isn't how she survived, but how she chose to live after escaping hell. She used her influence to help families in similar situations, especially parents with missing children. The message she sent them was always, never give up searching for your child. All the money, about 300,000 euros from television interviews, was donated by Natasha to charities in Africa and Mexico. This showed her compassionate heart, someone who had suffered but still wanted to share with those less fortunate. Currently, Natasha works as a television host and actively participates in charitable activities. She has learned to not care about the disparaging words around her and focus on positive things ahead. Symbol of freedom. One of the most beautiful images of Natasha's current life is her love of horseback riding. She says the feeling of riding horses and wandering in nature brings her the most wonderful feeling that 8 years of captivity had made her long for. This image has deep symbolic meaning. From a girl trapped in a dark, 5-square-meter bunker, Natasha can now run freely across endless grasslands. Valuable lessons. The Natasha Kampusch case leaves many important lessons about the strength of the human spirit. Natasha's ability to survive and maintain her sanity under harsh conditions shows humanity's superior potential in the face of adversity. She not only survived, but also developed intellectually, learned many languages, and maintained hope throughout 8 long years. About the complexity of victim psychology. Natasha's reaction to her kidnapper shows that human psychology is much more complex than we usually think. Her lighting candles for Psychopil wasn't a sign of Stockholm Syndrome, but an expression of a complex psychological relationship after 8 years of contact with only one human being. About the importance of persistence in search efforts. Austrian police never gave up searching for Natasha, and this contributed significantly to her rescue. This story reminds us of the importance of never giving up hope. Remaining mysteries. Although Psychopil is dead and Natasha has been rescued, this case still leaves some unanswered questions. Was there really only one kidnapper, or did Psychopil have accomplices? Why was Natasha chosen as a target? These questions may never have definitive answers, but they don't diminish the meaning and lessons from this story. Final message. Natasha Kampusch's story ultimately isn't about crime and suffering, but about hope and resilience. It shows us that even in the worst circumstances, humans can still find ways to survive and even thrive. More importantly, it shows that we can choose how to respond to adversity. We can choose hatred and suffering, or we can choose forgiveness and helping others. Natasha chose the second path, and that transformed her from a victim into an inspiration for millions of people worldwide. She proved that no darkness can completely extinguish the light of the human spirit. Call to action. Thank you for patiently following the case files and joining us in exploring this touching and meaningful story. Natasha Kampusch's story isn't just an ordinary true crime case, but also a profound lesson about the strength of human will and the ability to overcome oneself. If today's story made you reflect, moved you, or taught you something meaningful, don't forget to hit, like to support the channel, and share. so that many others can also be inspired by this wonderful story. Subscribe to the Case Files channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the shocking cases, dramatic real stories, and valuable life lessons we'll bring you in upcoming episodes. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts about this story. Do you think Natasha's reaction to her kidnapper is understandable? And what impressed you most about today's story? And remember, in the true crime world full of dark stories, sometimes we also need stories about hope, about survival, and about humanity's extraordinary ability to overcome adversity. Natasha Kampusch's story is one of those stories. See you again in the next episode of the Case Files, where we'll continue exploring unsolved mysteries and real stories that are stranger than fiction. Take care and have a wonderful day.